Mr. Secretary, ISIS took credit for the bombing in Manchester, England. Update us on the strategy to defeat ISIS.
Well, what you saw in Manchester was emblematic of what this transnational threat is capable of doing. Recognizing that reality, we have somewhere around 65 nations, 67 nations. It's growing as we speak. Plus, we've got Interpol, the Arab League, the European Union, and as of 2 days ago, when President Trump was in Brussels with Secretary Tillerson, NATO has joined the coalition as well as NATO organization. Our strategy right now is to accelerate the campaign against ISIS. It is a threat to all civilized nations, and you saw that statement being given by President Trump in Riyadh. You've heard it out of Brussels. This is the understanding that Prime Minister May gave to the world about what had hit England. And the bottom line is we are going to move in an accelerated and reinforced manner, throw them on their back foot. We are going to shift from, we have already shifted from attrition tactics where we shove them from one position to another in Iraq and Syria to annihilation tactics where we surround them. Our intention is that the foreign fighters do not survive the fight to return home to North Africa, to Europe, to America, to Asia, to Africa. We're not going to allow them to do so. We're going to stop them there and take apart the caliphate.
Explain for people who don't understand what it means to be moving in an annihilation posture as opposed to attrition.
Well, attrition is where you keep pushing them out of the areas that they're in, John. And what we intend to do by surrounding them is to not allow them to fall back, thus reinforcing themselves as they get smaller and smaller, making the fight tougher and tougher. We're going to isolate those objectives, and you see that right now, for example, in western Mosul that is surrounded, and the Iraqi security forces are moving against them. Tal Afar is now surrounded. We have got efforts underway right now to surround their self-declared caliphate capital of Raqqa. That surrounding operation is going on, and once surrounded, then we'll go in and clean them out.
What does it mean on the ground, though? Does it mean just more raids, more from the air? What does it mean in practical terms that's changed as we get this acceleration?
Okay, in practical terms, with acceleration, we do have more advisors in locations where they can call for NATO airstrikes. We have got more intelligent stare going on as we stare at this enemy and find their vulnerabilities. And then we have the forces to move against them, principally by, with, and through our allies.
One of the things you've mentioned in this new accelerated tempo is that the president has delegated authority to the right level. What does that mean?
When you're in operations, the best thing you can do at the top level is get the strategy right. You have to get the big ideas right. You have to determine what is the policy, what is the level of effort you're willing to commit to it, and then you delegate to those who have to execute that strategy to the appropriate level. What's the appropriate level? It's the level where people are trained and equipped to take decisions so we move swiftly against the enemy. There is no corporation in the world that would, in a competitive environment, try and concentrate all decisions at the corporate level. You don't do that because in a competitive environment, you've got to move swiftly in order to take the lead. In this case, we delegate to the appropriate level, but I would point out here that we have not changed the rules of engagement. There is no relaxation of our attention to protect the innocent, even while we work with an enemy who intentionally will not allow civilians to pull out of areas they're fighting in, who intentionally endangers them, has used civilians as human shields. We do everything we can to protect the civilians, and actually delegating the authority to the lower level allows us to do this better.
Does that mean at the lower level where these decisions are now being made, people have more freedom to move, less chance they're going to get second-guessed? Is that what it means in practical terms?
It means they can use their initiative, John. They can use their initiative and maintain the integrity of the fight, the managerial integrity of the fight, thus reducing the danger to innocent people caught up on a battlefield. Unlike ISIS, we believe the battlefield is also a humanitarian field. Look at what the Iraqis are doing, getting relief supplies set up so they are ready for the refugees who are going to be forced out of these areas as the fighting continues. We have got to recognize we cannot leave these areas under ISIS control. If you leave them under ISIS control, from Ankara to Brussels, from Paris to Manchester, we'll continue to see them using this haven to export violence. We have got to go after them, and at the same time we have to protect the civilians who are caught up on these humanitarian fields.
So in that case, do you mean after the annihilation has been done, does that mean you can't let it fall back into ISIS hands, that it has to be held essentially in some way?
ISIS is defeated. There's a larger effort underway to make certain that we don't just sprout a new enemy. For example, Secretary Tillerson about 2 months ago ran a meeting at the U.S. Department of State where 60-odd nations plus Interpol and the Arab League and others joined him. And the whole, I would say, conference, at least 85% of it, is what about the next step? We know ISIS is going to go down. We've had success on the battlefield. We've freed millions of people from being under their control, and not 1 inch of that ground that ISIS has lost has ISIS regained. It shows the effectiveness of what we're doing. However, there are larger currents, there are larger confrontations in this part of the world, and we cannot be blind to those. That is why they met in Washington under Secretary Tillerson's effort to carry out President Trump's strategy to make certain we don't just clean out this enemy and end up with a new enemy in the same area.
How does this new accelerated tempo feel, in your estimation, from those who are now getting to make the decisions at the appropriate level? Has it changed in terms of the operational tempo or the climate for those who are now getting to make decisions to move to use that initiative you talked about?
Our allies have been very positive in their assessments of what has changed.
You served under President Obama. You're now serving President Trump. How are they different?
Everyone leads in their own way, John. Everyone leads in their own manner. In the case of the President of the United States, in the case of the President, he has got to select the right people that he has trust in to carry out his vision of a strategy. And I would just tell you that right now that with Secretary Tillerson and I, we try to have breakfast at least once a week. We are on the phone 4 or 5 times a week together. We coordinate all of the President's campaign. We just make certain that foreign policy is led by the State Department. I inform Secretary Tillerson of the military factors, and we make certain that then when we come out of our meetings, State Department and Defense Department are tied tightly together, and we can give straightforward advice to the Commander-in-Chief.
President Trump has said to defeat ISIS, he has said there has to be a humiliation of ISIS. What does that mean?
I think as we look at this problem of ISIS, it's more than just an army. It's more than just a fight that we have on our hands in terms of military forces, law enforcement. It's also a fight about ideas. And we have got to dry up their recruiting. We have got to dry up their fundraising. The way we intend to do it is to humiliate them, to divorce them from any nation giving them protection, and humiliating their message of hatred, of violence. Anyone who kills women and children is not devout. They cannot dress themselves up in false religious garb and say that somehow this message has dignity, this message has continuity. We're going to strip them of any dignity. We're going to strip them of any kind of legitimacy, and that is why you see the international community acting in concert. And as the Americans provide more forceful leadership, more aggressive leadership, accelerated leadership in this campaign, you see more nations signing up.
This aggressive leadership, this aggressive tempo, when should Americans look to see victory?
This is going to be a long fight. The problems that we confront are going to lead to an era of frequent skirmishing. We will do it by, with, and through other nations. We will do it through developing their capabilities to do a lot of the fighting. We'll help them with intelligence. Certainly we can help train them for what they face. And you see our forces engaged in that, from Africa to Asia. But at the same time, this is going to be a long fight, and I don't put timelines on fights.
The fight is more aggressive. That means more casualties, doesn't it?
It doesn't have to mean more casualties. At times it means the enemy may suffer more casualties. It's not an automatic that we will. There is obviously, to our young troops going into harm's way, they know what they're getting into. They're the best trained in the world. They're superbly equipped. And right now I would just tell you that the enemy, we intend to make the enemy pay the price. We're going to do everything we can to keep our allies and our troops alive.
What about civilian casualties as a result of this faster tempo?
Civilian casualties are a fact of life in this sort of situation. We do everything humanly possible, unlike our enemy, unlike our adversary, whether it be Lebanese Hezbollah and the way they fought against the Israelis, we've seen that, or you look at ISIS in their fight against the international community. No matter where you find these terrorists, Al-Qaeda, they have a callous disregard for human life, for civilian life. We, on the other hand, do everything humanly possible, consistent with military necessity, taking many chances to avoid civilian casualties at all costs.
Under this new aggressive posture, what can be done that could not have been done or would not have been done, say, 6 months ago?
Probably the most important thing we are doing now is we are accelerating this fight. We are accelerating the tempo of it. We are going to squash the enemy's ability to give some indication that they have invulnerability, that they can exist, that they can send people off to Istanbul, to Belgium, to Great Britain and kill people with impunity. We're going to shatter their sense of invincibility. They're in the physical caliphate. That's only one phase of this. Then we have the virtual caliphate that they use the internet. Obviously, we're going to have to watch for other organizations growing up. But the bottom line is we're going to continue to press against them, and that's got to be the method that we use right now. We cannot go into some kind of complacency. I'm from the American West. We have forest fires out there, and some of the worst forest fires in our history, the most damage were caused when we pulled the fire crews off the line too early. And so we're going to have to continue to keep the pressure on the enemy. There's no room for complacency on this.
100 civilians were killed after a U.S. bomb hit a building in Mosul in Iraq. Is this the result of this faster tempo? Is this the kind of thing Americans need to get used to as a natural byproduct of this strategy?
The American people and the American military will never get used to civilian casualties. We will fight against that every way we can possibly bring our intelligence and our tactics to bear. In this case, again, people who had tried to leave that city were not allowed to by ISIS. We are the good guys. We're not the perfect guys, but we are the good guys. And so we're doing what we can. We believe we found residue that was not consistent with our bomb. So we believe that what happened there was that ISIS had stored munitions in a residential location, showing once again the callous disregard that has characterized every operation they have run.
In North Korea, Americans have been used to a certain kind of warfare for the last 16 years in the Middle East. Help people understand what a conflict with North Korea would be like and how it would be different.
A conflict in North Korea, John, would be probably the worst kind of fighting in most people's lifetimes. Why do I say this? The North Korean regime has hundreds of artillery cannons and rocket launchers within range of one of the most densely populated cities on earth, which is the capital of South Korea. We are working with the international community to deal with this issue. As you're aware, numerous administrations, Republican and Democrat, have tried to deal with this issue in the past, aligned with our allies and other nations. Right now, this regime is a threat to the region, to Japan, to South Korea, and in the event of war, they would bring danger to China and to Russia as well. But the bottom line is it would be a catastrophic war if this turns into combat, if we're not able to resolve this situation through diplomatic means.
North Korea has been testing missiles. Are they getting any better at their capability?
We always assume that with a testing program, they get better with each test.
You say North Korea is a threat to the region. Is North Korea a threat to the United States?
It is a direct threat to the United States. They have been very clear in their rhetoric. We don't have to wait until they have an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear weapon on it to say that now it's manifested completely.
What is the line in North Korea that if the regime crosses that line, in your view, the U.S. should take action?
Yeah, I'd prefer not to answer that question, John. The president needs political maneuver room on this issue. We do not draw red lines unless we intend to carry them out. We've made very clear that we're willing to work with China, and we believe China has tried to be helpful in this regard.
Give me a sense, if you can, of the time when you think North Korea would get to a position where they might either have an intercontinental ballistic missile on which they could put a nuclear warhead or where they could get to the point of no return.
We consider it a direct threat even today, the North Korean threat. As far as that specific threat, I don't want to put a timeline on it at this time. What we know, I'd prefer to keep silent about, because we may actually know some things the North Koreans don't even know.
Let me switch to NATO. The president recently met with NATO leaders. He didn't mention the commitment in NATO, the so-called Article 5 commitment, attack on one is an attack on all. Why not?
I think when President Trump chooses to go to NATO personally and stand there alongside the other more than 24 nations in NATO, that was his statement, not words, actions.
You are a strong believer in NATO. The president seems to need convincing on the power and importance of the NATO alliance. Do you have to convince him of how important NATO is?
We've had good talks about it, John. For example, in my initial job interview with the president right after Thanksgiving in New Jersey, I'd never met the president-elect before at that time, now president, and he brought up his questions about NATO. And my response was that I thought that if we didn't have NATO, that he would want to create it, because it's a defense of our values, it's a defense of democracy. He was very open to that. Obviously, he had to make a decision about whether or not he was going to hire me as nominate me to be the Secretary of Defense. And although I immediately showed him that my view on that was rather profoundly in support of NATO, he, at that point, nominated me to the Senate. So I would just tell you that he has demonstrated from his statement in front of the House and the Senate, where he said, I strongly support NATO, to his visit to Brussels on his first overseas trip. He's clearly made his statement about where he stands vis-a-vis NATO.
During the previous Obama administration, a senior NATO official said, we need to know that the Americans are with us. Are the Americans with NATO now? Can they be assured of that?
I have met with over half the counterparts I have from the NATO nations. They have no doubt that we are with them. And at this point, it's more how do we work together. There's no sense that they have to argue or discuss or question that commitment.
Are any NATO countries now under either threat or attack as you see it, either not militarily, but sometimes cyber?
They are under various forms of attack, John. For example, Turkey has an active insurgency. That's the PKK, the only NATO nation that confronts an active insurgency inside its borders. We have seen the terrorist threat, especially against the southern nations of NATO, but also, as we all saw just a week ago in Manchester, where children were murdered intentionally by ISIS-inspired terrorists. So the terrorist threat is real. From the east, we have Russia, which has declined to engage in a positive, productive manner, and is obviously, through its activities, shattered trust with a number of nations, especially along the eastern periphery. And at the same time, democratic processes, elections, the Russians have mucked around inside other people's elections. And so, yes, NATO recognizes the shifting sense of the threat.
The president has encouraged NATO members to pay up. Is that bearing any fruit?
It is. As of this year, we see a second year in a row of increased military spending. Taken together, the non-U.S. members of NATO spend 4 times as much on military defense than Russia does. So this is no insignificant amount. Furthermore, this is an organization of democratic nations, so every nation rightly gets its own say, but it is one that for the first time went into combat, went to war when the United States was attacked. It was organized, trained, equipped to rebuff the Soviet armies following World War II, and it never had to fire a shot. Probably the most successful military alliance in history. But when the United States was attacked, they all responded, and they were there with us in Afghanistan.
When the president puts pressure on these NATO members to pay up, is there any worry that might backfire, that they might, domestically, they don't want to look like they're bowing to the pressure of the American president?
I would just say that having been a NATO officer under President Bush and President Obama, and then having been back there in Brussels representing the Department of Defense under President Trump, that this is a consistent message that we have given the NATO nations, where President Bush wanted them to pay more for the common defense. They get the best defense in the world, the NATO countries, and we've all got to be willing to deal with it like a bank. If you want to take something out of it, you got to put something into it. President Obama sent the same message to NATO, that they had to pay their fair share. Finally, during President Obama's time, all the nations made a commitment in Wales that they would do that. So what President Trump is doing is consistent with both prior Republican and Democrat administrations. And the bottom line is the nations are spending more on defense now than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
What do the Russians want?
Beats me. Right now, Russia's future should be wedded to Europe. Why they see NATO as a threat is beyond me. Clearly, NATO is not a threat. It does not have aligned the offensive capability along its eastern border with Russia, or it's no threat to Western Russia or any other part. But right now, Russia is choosing to be a strategic competitor for any number of reasons. But the bottom line is NATO is not a threat, and they know it. They have no doubt about it. These are offensive actions by them when they go in cyber, or they go in with the kind of conduct they've had in Crimea and that sort of thing.
You've said that Russia is trying to break apart NATO. Is the United States going to take any action to deal with Russia as a threat to NATO, either in helping in the Balkans or in any other way?
Right now, we are dealing with Russia, attempting to deal with Russia under President Trump's direction in a diplomatic manner. And Secretary Tillerson, as you know, has met several times with his counterpart, and we are attempting to do that. At the same time, while willing to engage diplomatically, we are going to have to confront Russia when it comes to areas where they attack us, whether it be with cyber, or they try to change borders using armed force. And that's admittedly a strategically uncomfortable position, engaging diplomatically, trying to find a way out of this situation, but confronting them where we must. And we are going to continue in this mode, and hopefully soon our diplomats will work their magic and start moving us out of this quandary we find ourselves in.
Is there anywhere where America will confront Russia militarily?
That I would think not. I would hope not. But we do have, I was just up in Lithuania here about 2 weeks ago, where I saw U.S. soldiers as part of a German-led battle group in Lithuania that is reinforcing the Baltic nations. I will also say that even nations in Northern Europe that are not part of NATO are very, very uncomfortable with Russia's behavior over the last several years. And so this is not a paranoia on the part of the United States or on the part of NATO. This is a reality that Russia has acted in a manner that's very disheartening for all nations that want peace and prosperity in Europe.
When you served under President Obama, you were asked, I believe, by the president, what worries you? And you said 3 things: Iran, Iran, Iran. Is that still your feeling?
I had a more, let's just say, a narrower portfolio in those days because President Obama had assigned me as the commander of U.S. Central Command. And in the U.S. Central region, what we find is wherever there are challenges, wherever there is chaos, wherever there is violence, whether it be in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, the attempts to unsettle Bahrain, we always find Iran and the IRGC at it. And it's not the Iranian people. We are convinced it's a regime that is conducting itself in order to stay in power in Tehran as a revolutionary regime, not as a proper nation state. They are not looking out for the best interest of their own people. And so you've got this revolutionary cause that causes them to then go around creating mischief everywhere, to include trying to murder an Arab ambassador fewer than 2 miles from the White House a couple years ago. And I've seen the intelligence. This was not a rogue agent. This was an operation approved at the highest levels. And so ambassadors are men and women of peace. And for someone to try to murder an ambassador in Washington, D.C., you can understand why President Obama was committed to stopping the nuclear program.
What keeps you awake at night?
Nothing. I keep other people awake at night.
You mentioned to the New Yorker you were worried about the lack of political unity in America.
Well, I'm at West Point is where we're talking together, John, and you look at these young people who graduated today, over 900 of them, from all walks of life. Every religion probably in America is represented, every state is represented, and these people come together with an enthusiasm for protecting this experiment in democracy that we call America. And it takes people, I believe, with a fundamental respect for one another, with a fundamental friendliness toward one another, that I worry is starting to slip away in our country. We still have it in the military. It's a diverse force. It's a force that can work together under the worst conditions. And I just hope we can find our way back to engaging with one another, arguing strongly with one another, and then going down and having a root beer together or something, and having a good laugh about it as we work together for the best interests of the next generation of Americans who are going to inherit this country.
More than 40 years ago, you enlisted, and then today you speak as the Secretary of Defense at West Point. What's that like, going from those two different ends in the span of your career?
It's humbling, to tell you the truth, because as you go up, you realize how little, other than exercise good judgment, you really do, that it falls on the shoulders of very, very young people to carry this out inside the Department of Defense. I was an infantry officer in the Marines, and the infantry are named because they're infant soldiers, young soldiers, how they got their name. They're very young. And so it's really a humbling sense of just how great our younger generation is, how selfless it is, and what they are willing to commit, basically signing a blank check payable to the American people with their very lives to protect it. And that's really what I've come away from this job with, is a deeper sense of just being humbled by the commitment of others.
After Central Command, there was a report that you drove back home to your home state of Washington and stopped by the families of some of the people who'd paid that ultimate price. Can you tell us a little bit about that trip?
I'd prefer not.
Let me ask you about the Paris Climate Accords. The president is going to make a decision on those. Tell me about the national security role of climate change.
We've obviously got a discussion going on about our policy in this regard. And I was sitting in on some of the discussions in Brussels, by the way, where climate change came up. And the president was open. He was curious about why others were in the position they were in, his counterparts in other nations. And I'm quite certain the president is wide open on this issue as he takes in the pros and cons of that accord. And frankly, it's not inside my portfolio, that aspect. Obviously, we deal with the aspects of a warming climate in the Department of Defense, and to us, that's just another one of the many factors we deal with, which we call the physical environment.
You like to read books and history to prepare for moments. What book or history right now and prepares you for this moment? Is there one?
It would be hard to pick out one book. As far as a recent book that has struck me as helping to explain America, and I think it's a wonderful subject to study, it'd be Earning the Rockies by Kaplan. It's a wonderful new book that's out, and it's helped open my eyes to what our geographic situation is and how that has influenced us over many, many years.
Secretary Mattis, thanks so much.
You're welcome.